cold rain drifted across the hills outside Hazard, Kentucky, turning the narrow roads into dark ribbons of mud and reflected light. Old mining towns sat quietly beneath the Appalachian fog, their rusted gas stations and shuttered diners glowing faintly in the early afternoon like memories nobody had finished cleaning out. Inside the county animal shelter, the sound of barking bounced hard against concrete walls and metal kennel doors. Too loud, too bright. "That puppy's been sitting like that all morning." The woman at the front desk said it while sorting intake papers beside a humming space heater. Luke Carver glanced up only briefly before setting the last cardboard box of donated blankets near the counter. His younger sister had talked him into making the delivery after church that morning, promising it would take 10 minutes at most. 20 minutes later, he still had not left. A volunteer pushed a mop bucket past him, water sloshing over the cracked tile floor. Somewhere deeper in the building, a frightened dog barked in short, panicked bursts that sounded almost human between echoes. Luke felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes that always came from crowded indoor spaces after too long. Noise stacked on noise, movement stacked on movement. He had spent 16 years in the Navy, learning how to notice everything. Now he mostly tried to notice less. The shelter worker nodded toward the final kennel near the back wall. "German Shepherd mix," she said. "Few weeks old. Found near one of the old mining roads outside Jackson Creek." She lowered her voice slightly. "Doesn't respond to much." Luke walked farther down the row. At first he thought the kennel was empty. Then he saw the puppy sitting behind an old silver heater pushed against the corner wall. Small body, oversized paws, dark fur still soft with puppy fluff around the neck. The dog did not bark when Luke approached, did not whine, did not move toward the kennel door with the desperate excitement most shelter dogs carried like instinct. It simply sat there with its face turned toward the wall, still as winter would. A younger volunteer stopped beside Luke, holding a stack of stainless steel bowls. "We thought maybe he was sick at first," the kid said, "but the vet checked him yesterday." He shrugged once. "Honestly, he acts like the wall makes more sense than people." That line stayed in the air longer than it should have. If you're still here tonight, tell me where you're watching from down in the comments. Maybe it's a small Appalachian town, a quiet highway stop, or a city apartment with rain tapping against the windows. Wherever you are, we hope this story keeps you company for a little while. And if you believe quiet stories still matter, subscribe and stay for the next one. Luke crouched slightly near the kennel, but kept a few feet of distance between himself and the dog. The puppy never looked back at him, not even once. A shelter employee unlatched the kennel door carefully to slide fresh water inside, and the puppy pressed itself farther behind the heater without making a sound. Each time someone stepped closer to the kennel, the puppy backed farther behind the heater. Quiet, careful, like disappearing had become a habit. The volunteer shut the kennel again. "Under-socialized probably," he muttered. "Some dogs never really bounce back from that." Luke said nothing. He watched the kennel for another few moments while the room shifted around him. Someone laughed near the laundry area. Metal trays clattered together in the sink. Rain ticked softly against the narrow windows near the ceiling. The puppy remained facing the wall through all of it, as if disappearing was the safest thing it knew how to do. Then the volunteer walked away. The hallway quieted for half a breath and the puppy moved, only slightly. One ear twitched first. Then its head turned just enough for Luke to notice the food bowl sitting near the front of the kennel. The puppy stared at it cautiously before taking 2 small steps forward. Not while people watched, only after. Something old and uncomfortable shifted inside Luke's chest. After leaving the SEAL teams 2 years earlier, he had started arranging his life around the exact same instinct. Grocery stores near closing time. Coffee at 4:30 in the morning when nobody talked much. Meals eaten alone in his truck outside the rail depot instead of inside the crowded break room. Some nights he sat parked beside freight cars listening to diesel engines idle in the fog because it felt easier than going home too early. People thought loneliness always looked dramatic. Most of the time it just looked quiet. The puppy lowered its head toward the bowl, eating quickly while the kennel row stayed empty. The second footsteps echoed nearby again. It backed toward the wall. Luke stood slowly. The volunteer returned, carrying fresh towels. "You thinking about adopting?" he asked casually. "No," Luke answered. But the word felt less certain than he expected. By the time he stepped back outside, evening fog had already started sliding down the hills beyond town. Water dripped steadily from the shelter roof onto the gravel lot, while old trucks rolled past on the highway, carrying lumber and mining equipment farther east into the mountains. Luke pulled his jacket tighter and climbed into his faded Ford pickup without turning the radio on. The image stayed with him during the entire drive to the freight depot. The puppy sitting behind that heater, facing the wall, waiting for people to leave before feeling safe enough to eat. Hours later, near 2:10 in the morning, Luke stood alone beside a line of idle train cars checking security seals beneath floodlights and cold mist. The smell of wet steel and diesel hung heavily in the air while distant engines groaned somewhere farther down the tracks. But every quiet moment between those sounds brought the same image back again. A small German Shepherd puppy, trying not to be seen. Rain followed Luke Carver through most of eastern Kentucky that week. It clung to the truck windows during the drive back from the rail depot each morning and settled in the low valleys between the hills like wood smoke that never fully cleared. By 6:30, the roads around Hazard were already crowded with coal trucks and men heading toward jobs that started before daylight finished arriving. Luke usually drove straight home after his shift. Now he stopped at the shelter first. The woman at the front desk looked up when the bell above the door rattled open again. "Back already?" she asked with a tired smile. Luke lifted one shoulder. Was nearby. It was not entirely true. The shelter sat 12 miles out of his normal route home. He carried the same paper cup of vending machine coffee down the kennel row and sat in the metal folding chair near the back wall without saying much else. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere near the intake room, a beagle barked in frantic bursts while another dog scratched repeatedly at a kennel door. The German Shepherd puppy remained behind the old silver heater, but not as far back as before. Luke noticed that immediately. He pulled a folded rail inspection sheet from his jacket pocket and began filling in freight container numbers from the night shift. Seal conditions, lock status, arrival times from Lexington, the same dull paperwork he completed every morning before sleep. He kept his eyes mostly on the clipboard while the shelter slowly woke around him. After a few minutes, the puppy's ear twitched. Small movement, easy to miss. Luke kept writing. A volunteer named Darren stopped nearby carrying fresh blankets under one arm. Early 20s. Thin beard. University sweatshirt with bleach stains near the cuffs. Luke had seen him twice already that week. "You're kind of becoming his person now," Darren said casually. Luke shook his head once. "Dog doesn't even look at me." "That's the thing," Darren replied. "He barely looks at anybody." The puppy shifted slightly behind the heater as Darren stepped closer to the kennel. Its body tightened immediately. Luke saw the shoulders pull inward beneath the soft fur, small enough that most people would never notice unless they were looking carefully. Darren crouched beside the kennel door. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "Come on out a little." The puppy froze when Darren crouched beside the kennel. Its body tightened slightly beneath the heater, ears angled forward without making a sound. Darren sighed and stood again. "We've got to socialize him harder at some point," he muttered. "If people come in and see a dog hiding all day, they move on." Luke watched the puppy for another moment before speaking. "Maybe he's tired." Darren looked confused. "Tired of what?" Luke glanced toward the kennel, being watched. The younger man laughed softly like he thought Luke was joking, then wandered back toward the laundry room. The shelter quieted again around mid-morning. Rain tapped softly against the narrow windows near the ceiling, while the smell of wet concrete drifted through the hallway every time someone opened the side entrance. Luke remained in the chair with his paperwork balanced against one knee. Eventually the puppy moved, not toward him, toward the food bowl. It walked slowly, head low, pausing every few steps as if expecting interruption. Luke kept his attention fixed on the clipboard while the puppy began eating behind him, quick bites at first. Nervous, then slower once the room stayed calm. Luke remembered eating exactly like that during his first year after leaving the Navy. Truck stops at odd hours, corner booths facing walls. Food swallowed quickly before somebody tried starting conversation. People thought isolation always came from anger. Most of the time it came from exhaustion. By the third morning, the puppy no longer pressed itself fully behind the heater when Luke entered the kennel row. It stayed visible now, curled near the edge of the warm air with its eyes half closed. Once, while Luke sat drinking burnt coffee beside the wall, the puppy actually fell asleep for several minutes. Its breathing slowed, body loosened, paws twitching faintly in sleep. Luke noticed because animals never slept deeply unless they felt reasonably safe. The moment another volunteer pushed a noisy cart down the hallway, the puppy woke and pulled itself upright again. Darren noticed too. Well, he admitted reluctantly, that's more than he did last week. Luke folded his paperwork closed. Maybe quiet helps. Quiet doesn't get dogs adopted, Darren answered. That sentence stayed with Luke longer than he wanted. Near noon, the shelter director stepped into the kennel row carrying a clipboard against her chest. Her expression already told him the conversation would not be pleasant. "We're getting another intake transfer Friday," she said carefully. "Mostly abandoned hunting dogs from Pike County." She looked toward the puppy. "If he doesn't start adjusting better, we may have to move him into the main kennel room." Luke glanced towards the front half of the building, where barking echoed constantly from crowded rows packed too close together. The puppy would disappear in there. He knew it immediately. The director sighed softly. "It's not punishment. We just don't have endless quiet space." Luke nodded once, though something heavy settled behind his ribs anyway. The puppy had fallen asleep again beside the heater. One ear moved faintly at the sound of nearby footsteps, but it did not wake fully this time. For the first time all week, it had stopped facing the wall, only by a few inches. Still, Luke noticed, and somehow that made the thought of the crowded kennel room feel worse than it should have. The rain turned harder by Thursday night. Water rolled down the hills outside Hazard in muddy sheets, flooding narrow roadside ditches and washing loose gravel across Route 15. Freight trains moved slower through the valley under the weather, their steel wheels grinding heavily through fog while emergency alerts flickered across the small television mounted inside the rail depot break room. Luke Carver stood near the loading gates shortly after 3 in the morning, watching cold rain strike the floodlights beyond the tracks. Diesel smoke drifted low across the yard. Somewhere behind him, a forklift engine coughed twice before falling silent again. His phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. The shelter director sounded exhausted before she finished saying hello. "We lost partial heat in the back kennel room," she explained. "And Pike County just transferred 7 more dogs an hour ago." Rain crackled loudly through her end of the call. "I hate asking, Luke, but could you foster the shepherd puppy for a few days until we stabilize things here?" Luke stayed quiet for several seconds. Beyond the fence line, train horns echoed softly through the valley. "I've never fostered a dog," he finally said. "You don't have to fix him," she replied. "He just needs somewhere quieter for a little while." That sentence followed Luke the rest of the shift. By sunrise, the storm had settled deeper into the mountains. Water dripped steadily from the shelter roof while volunteers carried blankets and portable heaters between kennel rows. The building smelled like wet fur, bleach, and burnt coffee. The puppy sat near the heater again when Luke arrived. This time it looked up briefly when he stopped beside the kennel. Only for a second. The director crouched beside a cabinet searching for paperwork, while Darren assembled a temporary crate near the front desk. "Roads are getting worse farther east," Darren muttered. "State police already closed one bridge near Jackson Creek." Luke signed the foster forms without reading most of them. The puppy did not resist when the kennel door opened. It simply became very still while the director wrapped it carefully in an old gray blanket and carried it toward the crate. Luke noticed the way its eyes moved constantly during the walk through the hallway. Heater vents, ceiling light, shoes, swinging doors, tracking exits, tracking sound. Military dogs used to do the same thing before transport flights. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes through rain and mountain fog. Luke kept the radio off while windshield wipers dragged steadily across the glass. The puppy never barked from inside the crate behind the passenger seat. Once or twice he glanced back at it during stoplights, but mostly he focused on the road climbing through the hills outside town. His rental house sat near an abandoned rail spur east of Hazard where freight cars no longer stopped. Small place, 2 rooms, faded siding warped by years of Appalachian rain. A sagging porch light flickered weakly above the front steps. Inside, the heater hummed beside an old recliner facing the television. Luke opened the crate slowly. The puppy stepped out, crossed half the room, and disappeared behind the recliner almost immediately. Only one dark ear remained visible near the wall. Luke left it alone. He placed water beside the heater, set down a small bowl of food, then moved quietly through the kitchen, making coffee while rain tapped against the windows above the sink. The house felt unusually aware of itself that morning. Every floorboard creak seemed louder than usual. Every cabinet door sounded heavier. Another living thing changes the sound of a room. Luke slept for a few hours after sunrise. When he woke shortly after noon, the food bowl near the recliner was empty. The puppy had vanished again. He found it later behind the recliner exactly where he had left it, curled tightly against the wall beside the heater vent. Luke crouched briefly to refill the water bowl, then returned to the kitchen without speaking. That evening, he worked on an old tackle box at the dining table while low-country music drifted softly from the radio near the refrigerator. Rainwater slid down the windows in crooked lines. The smell of machine oil and black coffee settled into the room together. At some point after dark, Luke noticed movement near the hallway. The puppy stood there watching him. Not close, not hiding either. Its body remained cautious, weight balanced backward as if prepared to retreat the second the room changed too quickly. Luke kept working on the rusted latch in his hands without acknowledging the dog directly. A few minutes later, the puppy disappeared again. The next morning brought more small signs. Mud-specked paw prints near the toolbox beside the back door. A shifted rug in the hallway, one chew mark along the corner of an old boot. Luke noticed all of it while drinking coffee before work. The house no longer looked untouched. 3 nights into the Foster arrangement, the storm finally weakened enough for fog to replace rain. Luke returned from the rail yard around dawn carrying groceries in a paper sack beneath one arm. Eggs, bread, canned chili, cheap coffee filters. The puppy was asleep beside the bedroom doorway when he entered, not hidden behind furniture anymore. Luke stopped quietly near the kitchen table. The dog woke immediately at the sound of the door latch, lifting its head with startled eyes before realizing who stood there. For a moment, neither of them moved. The heater rattled softly through the hallway while freight horns echoed somewhere far beyond the hills. Then the puppy lowered its head back onto the floor, still wary, but tired enough to stay. Luke unpacked groceries slowly after that. Later, while frying eggs near the stove, he noticed the puppy following him from room to room at a careful distance, never close enough to touch, never far enough to disappear entirely. The movement reminded Luke of younger soldiers during their first weeks after deployment. Men who stopped trusting silence, because silence usually meant waiting for something worse. He understood that kind of exhaustion. By the end of the week, the house had developed rhythms Luke no longer expected from his life. The soft scrape of claws against linoleum before sunrise. The heater clicking on in the middle of the night. A small shape sleeping near the hallway instead of behind the recliner. Another breathing pattern inside the dark. The loneliness inside the house had not vanished, but it no longer sounded quite the same. The rain returned 2 days later. Not the hard mountain storms from the previous week. This rain moved slower across eastern Kentucky, drifting through the hills in long gray curtains that blurred headlights and softened the edges of abandoned buildings along the highway. Water collected beneath the rail tracks behind Luke Carver's house, while freight horns echoed low through the fog before sunrise. The puppy had started waiting near the kitchen doorway when Luke came home from night shift. Never excited, never jumping. It simply lifted its head at the sound of his truck tires on wet gravel, then watched quietly while he unlocked the front door and stepped inside, carrying the smell of diesel, cold air, and machine grease with him. Luke noticed those things more than he admitted. The shelter called that Thursday afternoon while he was replacing a broken cabinet hinge beside the sink. "There's a couple from Lexington interested in meeting him," the shelter director explained over the phone. "Older pair, quiet home. They've adopted shepherds before." Luke tightened the screwdriver once more before answering. Sounds good, and part of him meant it. The puppy deserved stability, space. Someone home more often than a man working overnight freight security beside abandoned rail lines. Still, after the call ended, Luke sat at the kitchen table longer than necessary with the screwdriver resting loosely in his hand. The house sounded different now. The heater clicked on beneath the hallway vent. Country radio drifted softly from the shelf above the refrigerator. Somewhere near the bedroom doorway, small claws shifted once against the floorboards before becoming quiet again. The meeting happened Saturday morning at the shelter. Luke drove separately. Fog covered most of the highway outside town, while damp leaves stuck to the parking lot beneath his boots. Inside the building, barking rolled through the kennel rows louder than he remembered. The puppy stayed pressed near Luke's leg during intake instead of wandering toward the volunteers. Darren noticed immediately. "Well," he muttered quietly, "that's new." The couple from Lexington arrived a few minutes later carrying calm voices and expensive rain jackets. They seemed kind enough. Older man with silver hair. Woman with gentle eyes behind fogged glasses. Neither rushed toward the puppy or crouched too close. Even so, the change in the dog came quickly. Its body tightened, eyes lowered. Movement slowed. Luke saw the puppy glance once toward the back corner of the room before settling beside the chair legs near the wall. The woman smiled carefully. "Poor little guy's still nervous." "He's getting there," Darren answered. Luke remained quiet through most of the visit. The older man asked practical questions about feeding schedules and training. Shelter staff discussed vaccinations and follow-up appointments while rain tapped steadily against the windows behind them. The puppy never barked once during the entire meeting. It barely moved at all. Later, when Darren tried taking updated profile pictures near the front desk, the puppy turned its face toward the corner beside the filing cabinet and stayed there despite the treats placed near the camera lens. Luke felt something sink slowly inside his chest when he saw that. The ride home stayed silent except for windshield wipers brushing rainwater across the glass. The puppy remained curled against the passenger side floorboard instead of sitting upright like it usually had during recent drives. That night, it refused dinner. Luke left the food bowl near the heater and walked away after a few minutes, pretending not to notice. Around midnight, he woke briefly to drink water and found the bowl still untouched beside the wall. The puppy lay asleep against his work boots near the front door, close enough that one paw rested partly across the leather. Luke stood there in the dark hallway longer than he should have. By Sunday afternoon, the shelter had already emailed preliminary transfer paperwork. Luke opened the forms at the kitchen table while weak rainlight drifted through the windows beside him. Name of foster guardian, potential adopter information, transfer authorization. Simple paperwork, the kind of forms people signed every day. The puppy slept in the middle of the living room while Luke read through the pages. Not beside the heater anymore, not behind the recliner. Its body rested loosely against the worn rug with one paw stretched outward toward the couch, completely exposed. Luke looked down at the paperwork again, then toward the dog. Darren's voice returned to him from the shelter parking lot earlier that morning. "Maybe you need him as much as he needs you." At first, Luke dismissed the comment as something careless said by a 20-year-old volunteer who did not understand much beyond surface observations. But the sentence stayed with him anyway, because some part of it felt uncomfortably close to true. The house had changed since the puppy arrived. Not dramatically. There were still unpaid bills near the microwave, still rust stains beneath the kitchen sink, still long overnight shifts at the freight depot with coffee growing cold beside stacks of inspection reports. But now another living thing moved through those rooms. Another heartbeat occupied the silence, and Luke was no longer certain whether helping the dog meant letting it go. Rain tapped steadily against the windows through most of the evening. Freight horns drifted faintly across the valley, while Luke sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the unsigned transfer papers beneath the yellow light above the stove. At some point after midnight, he realized the house had gone completely still. Luke looked up. The puppy was asleep in the center of the living room floor, not facing the wall, not hiding beside furniture, sleeping openly for the first time since arriving there. Luke watched the dog for a long while without moving. Then he folded the paperwork closed and set it quietly aside. Winter settled slowly across eastern Kentucky. The hills around Hazard turned pale beneath morning frost while thin ice gathered along drainage ditches beside the highway. Most evenings, smoke rose from chimney pipes across the valley just before dark, hanging low beneath the clouds until freight horns carried through the cold air from somewhere beyond the mountains. Luke Carver noticed the changes inside his house before he noticed them anywhere else. The puppy had grown heavier over the past several weeks. Its oversized paws no longer looked awkward against the kitchen floor, and the dark fur around its shoulders had thickened enough to soften the sharp outline of its ribs. The shelter paperwork still listed no official name, but Darren eventually stopped asking whether Luke planned to choose one. The answer had become obvious long before either man said it aloud. Mercer. Luke wrote the name automatically one morning while labeling a bag of dog food near the pantry shelf. Simple name, quiet name. It fit the dog better than anything else he tried. Mercer still startled easily around strangers. Delivery trucks passing too close to the porch made his ears rise immediately. Sudden voices outside the gas station caused him to pause beside Luke's leg until the noise moved away again. Whenever visitors came near the house, Mercer drifted toward quieter corners of the room without barking or showing aggression, but he no longer disappeared. That part mattered. Most mornings Luke returned from the rail depot shortly before dawn while frost still silvered the gravel road outside the house. The truck headlights would sweep across the porch railing as he pulled in beside the old rail spur behind the property. Before long, he began noticing the same thing waiting through the front window each morning. A dark shape lifting slowly from the rug near the couch. Mercer never rushed the door. He simply waited there while Luke unlocked it, body calm now instead of tense. Sometimes the dog followed him into the kitchen while coffee brewed. Other mornings he settled beside the table, watching steam rise from Luke's cup while distant train engines rolled through the valley. The silence inside the house had changed shape over time. Not gone, changed. One Saturday afternoon, Luke repaired loose boards beneath the porch steps while weak winter sunlight filtered through the bare trees behind the yard. Mercer stayed nearby the entire time, lying beside the toolbox with his head resting across one paw. Every so often he watched passing trucks disappear along the road before lowering his eyes again toward the sound of Luke's hammer against old wood. At one point, a neighbor's grandson wandered over chasing a basketball that had rolled near the ditch. The boy stopped immediately when he saw the German Shepherd. "Does he bite?" he asked carefully from the edge of the yard. Luke glanced toward Mercer. The dog remained where he was, alert but still, ears angled forward beneath the pale afternoon light. "No," Luke answered. "He just likes quiet." The boy nodded like he understood more than most adults did. Mercer watched him for another few seconds before lowering his head again beside the toolbox. That night, freezing rain tapped softly against the windows, while Luke heated canned chili on the stove. Merce slept near the couch instead of beside the heater now. Country radio drifted low through the kitchen, barely loud enough to cover the sound of sleet touching the roof. Luke found himself talking occasionally without meaning to. Not conversations, just remarks carried into the room naturally. Roads were bad near Pike County tonight, or freight train stalled outside Ashland for 3 hours. Mercer usually answered by lifting one ear briefly before settling again, still quiet, still cautious, but present. December storms rolled through the valley harder near Christmas. One evening thunder shook the windows shortly after midnight, while rain hammered the roof hard enough to wake Luke from the recliner. For a moment he sat listening to the storm move through the hills beyond town. Then he noticed Mercer asleep in the middle of the living room floor. Not beside the wall. Not behind furniture. The dog barely reacted when thunder cracked again overhead. One eye opened briefly at the sound before closing once more against the rug. Luke watched him quietly from the chair. A few months earlier, that same dog would have hidden behind the heater at the shelter the moment another kennel door slammed too hard nearby. Now he slept through storms with his body stretched openly across the center of the room. Not fearless, just safe enough to rest. The realization settled over Luke slowly during the weeks that followed. Mercer had never needed somebody louder, or stricter, or better at training broken things. He had needed steadiness, routine, a room where nobody kept demanding proof that he was improving. The same thing Luke himself had spent 2 years searching for without knowing how to describe it. Near the end of January, fog covered the valley before sunrise so heavily that the abandoned rail tracks behind the house nearly vanished beneath the gray. Luke sat asleep in the recliner with an untouched cup of coffee cooling beside his hand. He had come home exhausted from a double shift at the depot sometime after 4 in the morning and never made it farther than the living room. Outside, a freight horn echoed softly through the hills. Mercer lay stretched across the middle of the floor beneath the dim yellow lamp near the couch. His breathing moved slow and even in the quiet room while pale winter light gathered gradually along the windows. Luke opened his eyes sometime later and looked toward the dog. Mercer remained asleep, facing the room instead of the wall. The old instinct to disappear had finally loosened its grip enough to let him rest. Luke sat there for a long while, listening to the heater hum softly through the house and the distant sound of trains moving through eastern Kentucky. Then he lowered his eyes toward the cold coffee beside him and understood something simple enough that it almost hurt. Mercer had never been failing at life inside that shelter. He had only been tired. And sometimes healing begins the moment exhaustion is no longer mistaken for weakness. I think a lot of people go through life looking perfectly fine while quietly carrying a kind of exhaustion nobody else can see. Not fear, not anger, just the feeling of always needing to brace themselves before walking into another room, another conversation, another day. Watching Luke and Mercer find peace beside each other reminded me that healing does not always arrive through grand moments or dramatic change. Sometimes it begins in a quiet house with soft footsteps in the hallway, a cup of coffee gone cold, and the simple relief of finally feeling safe enough to rest. If this story stayed with you tonight, we'd truly love to hear where you're watching from and what part touched your heart the most. Maybe you've known loneliness. Maybe you've carried grief quietly. Or maybe someone once gave you the kind of patience that helped you breathe again. Share your thoughts, your prayers, or your story down in the comments so others reading may feel a little less alone too. And if you believe quiet stories about kindness, healing, and second chances still matter in this world, please like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for the next journey. Until then, take care of yourself. And take a moment tonight to pray for someone who may be carrying more than they show.